welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. Today, we are continuing our discussion on I'll Give You a Reason and are joined by Anel Lopez.
Hi. Hi. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
I don't know. What do we say? I'm Vanessa, and this is Richie and Reina. Our other co-host, Jorge, wasn't able to make it today, unfortunately.
No.
Yeah, but he gave us his questions, so we'll try to get through whatever we can and still honor your time. So
yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, for reading the book and for doing the 2 other podcasts. I had fun listening to your conversations. That was awesome. Yeah.
Yay. All right. Should we get started?
Yeah.
Do you want to do
should I do it now or after?
We can do it after. Okay.
We're going to dive right into it.
Yes, let's
do it. I want to first and foremost congratulate you on winning the Louise Merriweather First Book Prize. So we wanted to ask you what that felt like.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It felt very intense, but also, life-changing. So it was a pathway to publication to get the book out. It's really hard to get a book out in the world. As you can all imagine, it's hard to get stories published out. So anything that has to do with publishing, it's like almost next to impossible, or so it can feel sometimes. So, I had submitted the book or the manuscript for the prize. And I tried to manage my expectations, because I know just there's a lot of good work out there. So I wasn't sure. So learning that I had gotten it was, I was so excited. It was overwhelming. I was ready to do backflips. If I could physically do backflips, I would.
That's amazing.
That is amazing, especially being the first book. I mean, that's just wow. So I'm assuming that this is opening more doors for you. And since you're talking about it, publishing being so difficult, I think Vanessa had a question about that.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of ask you about your submission process. Some of these stories have been published in other journals and magazines and things. But just your submission process for this book and also your stories.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started writing the stories around 2018. I think I sort of began to take them, sort of the first couple of stories, take it really seriously. Or take writing very seriously. And then I started submitting around 2018, 2019. Very new to the process. So I was, obviously, like everyone else, getting rejections. And I was lucky that I came across, really good writers and mentors that were very much encouraging. So like Maurice Carlos Ruffin was a person who blurbed the book and was also a mentor and a friend who said to me, whenever I complained or said something about, I got rejected from here or from there, he did say, I've had this many rejections. Like my numbers are, so high. That's part of the process. That's nothing. And so it put into perspective to me that it was, something that happens to everyone. And sort of like the name of the game is just to keep submitting, and just to keep going, because the rejections are part of the process. But, you don't really see it that way when you're in the middle of it. And when you're like brand new, it feels so personal, and it feels so damaging. But then you sort of start to understand that, this happens to all of us. This is part of the process. For every 10 stories that I'll send out, maybe 1 will get picked up. And those are really good odds. So I started sending them out. I became a little more ambitious about the journals where I would send them out. Got one of the stories into a really good journal, and it sort of made me feel very validated, where it was like, well, actually, the odds of getting them picked up by journals is so hard. So when that was happening, I just felt empowered. So, if 2 stories can be out there, maybe 3 or 4 can be out there. And I just sort of kept going from there on. But, the process is a lot of, reminding yourself that rejection is normal and inevitable. and you don't get all you need is one yes, really. But you don't get that one yes. It's like kissing all the frogs, the princes out there. Just got to keep going. Yeah.
That's great because I'm glad we're glad you mentioned Maurice because we've covered him twice already on the podcast, and then I've had the pleasure of meeting him in person, and he is very supportive like that.
Yeah.
It's nice to hear that, and
Yeah,
for all our
he is.
listeners to just hear more about that. Rejection is such a part of that process too. This other in terms of our podcast, this is our first time kind of coming back to short stories in quite some while. We had been covering a lot of poetry. So, what drew you into the short story as your medium?
I love short stories all my life. I'm actually sort of becoming a novelist right now, but short stories were always the form that I was attracted to. And I think that, I read Junot Diaz's Drown. I think in 2008 or shortly after I graduated from high school, I was in college. I read Drown, and then I read The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, but the stories really sort of called to me, and I felt like, wow, this is so well done. Novels are cool, but this is such a great form. From that story collection, I started just devouring more and more collections, like the work of like Danielle Evans and Barb Johnson, who ended up being my professor at the University of New Orleans. But I was consuming short stories. And with that, I felt sort of very compelled to work on the form myself. I ended up not writing for a long time and now working my way back to writing till probably 10 years after, sort of falling in love with short stories. But I always loved the form. I think that it's in many ways sort of understated and misunderstood, but it can be very powerful. Just as powerful in collections that are well done as a novel, I would argue. I'm just a fan of the form.
Yeah, it's great.
That kind of ties into a question that Jorge had for you in terms of your literary heroes, and you mentioned Junot Diaz and Maurice Carlos Ruffin serving as a mentor for you. But is there anyone else that, as you started writing, or in college, that you read or that you wanted to emulate or that you just found very inspiring?
Yeah, so as a reader, definitely, Junot Diaz, because for one, I just didn't see that much representation, right? So like books by, Latinx, Hispanics like Junot Diaz, Sandra Cisneros, and then to me, that was really it. Eventually I would find my way around other people, but, at the time, I wasn't in an MFA. I was just sort of, not really in a literary world sort of life. Those people sort of, they taught me that, like we are telling our own stories and we can do it just as any other story. Later, as I became more and more interested in writing professionally, I met people like Maurice Carlos Ruffin. I read collections such as like Sabrina and Corina, which were very instrumental. Disha Filios, The Secret Life of Church Ladies, more Danielle Evans, whose first collection, Before You Suffocate Your Own Full Self, was life-changing for me, and whose second collection, The Department of Historical Corrections, was also really good work that I really loved reading. I found Clavis Natera. I was already sort of in the process of writing, but this was someone who, a fellow Dominican, Angie Cruz, people who I admire. Books that sort of, in some way either motivated me or made me feel empowered to write my own. Yep.
What a great list.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
I'll go next.
Yeah, I felt like I kind of tied into your question about music.
Oh yeah, so we were reading one of the interviews with Rumpus actually, and you talked about incorporating music into your routine as a writer, and how you listen to different artists and genres, like while writing different stories in the collection. Can you talk a little bit more about that process, like using music and
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that question. I like feel like music might just be, I don't know. I would like to be like a music journalist in my dreams. I don't know. I love music. Yeah, I think that music was so very instrumental. I think that it just sort of helps me stay in a particular headspace, whether, some of the short stories are very intense in terms of emotions. And I felt, writing into things like grief or sadness or even romance or even happiness that I sort of had to stay and sustain a very specific mood, just to keep the tone or the atmosphere or the feeling of the story consistent. And the fastest way to do that was just really through songs, where I would just be like, I guess I'm going to be listening to this really sad stuff for a minute, and just going to be depressed along with the song for a while, but it sort of keeps me in that headspace. I like to make playlists for the stories, and I like to create playlists for the characters. And I'm like, this character, I feel like this is what she's going to be listening to, and so I'll really sort of try to embody what that looks like for the character, and music helps me stay. I want to say emotionally in the story and consistent throughout.
That's a really good technique. Now,
Yeah.
just as a quick follow up to that, do you ever share those publicly or those playlists, or is that just
Um,
for you?
Yeah, I've shared them with friends. I don't think I've shared them publicly yet. I've been wanting to, and so I've played around with writing, you know, a little bit about the music behind the collection. I hope to probably send it in as an article somewhere at some point. But yeah, I do want to. I love music, and I love writing about music, but I've never done so professionally. But it's a bit of like a aspiration at some point. I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we look forward to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
So another one of Jorge's questions was, which story are you most proud of and why? So you started talking a little bit about characters and getting into their headspace. And so we wanted to hear a little bit about, from this collection, which one you felt most proud of.
That's a great question. I think that, there were some stories there that really just give me a run for my money, in terms of like, man, I'm gonna be rewriting this forever. I'm really proud of The Fake Wife. And that was a story that was a complete rewrite. It was like a version of the story was a flash piece, so very short. But I knew rhythmically that the collection needed something longer, specifically toward the end, and I wanted the reader to feel like they were anchored in something a little more substantial, because the rhythm sort of picks up with the shorter pieces. So I did a complete rewrite of that story. The book was already edited with the exception of that one story. So I went to my editor, I asked to rewrite it. She said, okay. And I just sat down, and I started all over. And I think I'm proud of that, because when you write something, it's so hard to give up what you already like accomplish, or like what you have on the page. Like, it's daunting to start over and say, you know what, scratch that, let's just start over. Which is what I did with that. I was just like, I have these characters, I know sort of where they're going, but I'm just gonna disregard everything that I worked on so far and start all over from the beginning. Um, and I was proud to sort of work up the courage to do that. And yeah, I think that's the story that I feel the most proud. Um, I'm also proud of Bear Hunting Season, just because of the sheer number of rewrites that it took me. Took me a lot to sort of get it where I wanted it to be. You know, when you start rewriting a story 5, 7, 10, 12 times, you're like on the 20th version of the same story. It
Yeah.
really, it's a test.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So speaking of tests, and speaking of Bear Hunting Season, we also read that you were developing that into your novel. And so I guess the question that I would like to ask is I guess if that has been a test for you, since you're more, inclined to write short stories, and how has that been, for you, that process?
Yeah, it has been. I think the beauty of a short story, at least for me, is that you sort of, the end is in sight, right? It's like, okay, I finished this. And then you get to have this sense of accomplishment of, oh, I wrote this and like, I'm done. I can take a break. I think that with a novel, it feels so continuous that it's like, oh my God, I can't see the end in sight. And I'm sort of like getting a little impatient, a little desperate. So I just kind of want it to be over. So I'm learning a lot how to be patient. Um, I'm far enough in the manuscript that the end is in sight. So I'm happy about that. But for a long time, it just sort of felt like I was, writing in the dark, where I'm like, okay, I think that this is where I'm going. Whereas the short story form is so controlled that sometimes, I'm sitting down and I already have an idea of where I'm headed. The novel feels, sort of, a winding road in a way, and it's like, you sort of have to pull it back together. It's a different process, and it's definitely a test. But I think I've sort of found my way around it.
I had a question and then I lost it. Um, oh, okay. So I kind of wanted to, I'm looking into MFA programs and just graduate programs. How did you go
Yeah,
about selecting
congratulations.
one? Thank you. How did you go about finding one that was like right for you? What were some things that you were looking out for? And then as a follow-up question, were some of these stories from your MFA?
Yeah. So I'll start with the follow-up part. Most of them were written during the MFA. Only a handful were before the MFA and got me in the MFA, or were published before the MFA. But the bulk of the work was MFA work. So it was my thesis, for the most part. I When it came to MFAs, I wasn't sure that I was going to do it. So I knew that I wanted to write. I had sort of been a reader for a long time. And then around 2018, 2019, I moved to New Orleans from New Jersey. And, I sort of realized that I wanted to write more than anything. Um, and I knew that I could write without the MFA. So I'd started a couple of the stories. But in conversation, that's my dog, I'm sorry. In conversation with people in New Orleans, Maurice being one of them, I asked him, what was the advantage, because he graduated from the same program that I did. And so he said something along the lines of, like, obviously, like the MFA, like, you'll learn a lot. But the main function that it would do for someone like me who was writing outside of it would be that it would sort of accelerate the process. Um, so however long I was going to take on the stories, the MFA would speed that up. And I understood that that was something that I really wanted, because I wanted to sort of, kick it into a higher gear and really, really write. So the MFA, that's what I wanted from the MFA. When I started looking at programs, because I had just moved to New Orleans, and then, from New Jersey to New Orleans, like, such a big move and like such a huge cultural transition, I could not imagine going to any other city and do another move. So it was going to be either I get into the University of New Orleans or bust. So I was just like, it's either that program, because I'm not moving again, or it's no program. So that was sort of how I went about it. It was like, if I'm meant to go to an MFA, I'll get in, and then this is it. And then if not, then I guess it's not. I'll just write without it. But it was mostly just because of, yeah, just the idea of starting new. It's the only program in the city of New Orleans, just to give you some context. So it was the only MFA available to me here. And I just, for the life of me, could have not imagined moving again. Looking back, what I would say, things that I think are valuable for an MFA and that I would tell anyone looking for an MFA program would be to find somewhere where you're going to get a real sense of community. Like, writing is a very sort of, isolated endeavor, but at the same time, you need people. And what I loved about, specifically here in New Orleans, because I did end up finding community even outside of the MFA, was just a community, right? So, running into people who are at different stages in their career and who feel sort of, very open to sharing their experiences, whether they are on their 10th book or whether they are just on their first book or still writing the book. I think that, going to a program where it's community focused, it's involved in the town, they go to readings, they organize things, that would be the thing that I will look for the most, is community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that.
I love that too. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of aspects in the book that I think would be fun to explore with you. I don't know how we're doing on time here, but I did want to ask about the Ironbound neighborhood and how you decided to kind of use that to connect as a connection to all the stories, and I guess to like have the portrayal of the American dream in New York.
Yeah, the Ironbound is a very special place. So it's where I grew up. It's a very immigrant heavy neighborhood, and it's always been that way. So like traditionally, it's sort of always served as that little slice of I don't know, a safe haven for people, right? So back in hundreds of, or I guess 100 years ago, you had sort of very European immigration, and so a lot of European descent people sort of made it their home. As decades have gone by, we've had more sort of Latin American people move in, so the demographics have changed, but the neighborhood and what it stands for and what it is hasn't. So it's always a place where you'll find a group of immigrants sort of settling in, especially in a city like Newark. And so I love that because, I'm an immigrant myself. And then sort of moving into the US from the DR, it was nice to be in a place where there were a ton of other immigrants too. And, I went to high school with people from Central America, with people from South America, with people from the Caribbean like myself, with people from Europe. And it was nice that we all sort of were fumbling our way through, we came from our individual countries. We're all learning English. We're trying to get to college. We're trying to do these things. So the neighborhood has always been very special like that. It's like, I think it's very rare, thinking of the country, to find these pockets where people can, sort of defy expectations when it comes to immigrants and what they're supposed to accomplish and who they are supposed to be. And I think that the Ironbound was, not limiting in any way like that, right? Where it's like, sure, I just arrived in the country, but, teachers were never like, you can only do this. It was like, oh, you just arrived. Cool. Because this other person just arrived and they're doing this. And this other person just arrived from, I don't know, El Salvador, and they're doing that. Look how well they're doing. And so I think that's unique. And I don't know that there are a lot of communities that are like that, but I think that, it's always and will always be very dear to my heart. I just had to write about it.
Yeah. And the scope, and between all the stories, I think the scope and switching of perspectives is so well done.
Mm.
Thank you.
Mm.
Yeah.
It was really nice for us to read about this area because our community is a pretty close-knit community as well. And I mean, at least me, I'm not familiar with the East Coast very much. So it was nice to learn about Newark and to learn about these communities.
Mm-hmm. I
Yeah.
agree. Yeah. Think you had one more
Thank you
question
for
I should
for
ask?
engaging.
Well, I have one more question, and that's just you've already kind of given little nuggets of wisdom throughout the interview, but any advice that you have for aspiring writers who might be listening?
Yeah, I think that keep writing. Keep writing, send things out, keep submitting. Be vocal about your goals, I would say. I think that sometimes we may find ourselves very hesitant to say, I'm a writer or I am an artist. I think that there is sometimes, a little bit of shame if you're not sort of where you think you should be, or fear in acknowledging that thing that you want to be. But I think that it is really helpful, not to be very woo-woo about things, but I do think that, you can in many ways speak something into existence, or like, tell yourself that something is going to happen, or if anything, sort of, put yourself on the path of making things happen, because the more you say it, the more you really are believing it. And I think that sometimes people shy away from saying things like, I'm a writer, and would say things like, I'm trying to write, or I'm attempting. And it's like, you're already doing it. There's no trying, like you are. So I think that being vocal about goals, it's important. And just a good old, what everybody will say, don't be discouraged by rejection as part of the process. Sort of keep going. But I would say, yeah, call yourself the thing that you are. Even if you don't have the MFA, even if you don't have the book yet, like you are a writer, you are a writer.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, I love that. I guess, is there anything else you'd like for our listeners to have or take with them, or anything you'd like to add?
Or anything you'd
Yeah,
like
I mean,
to plug?
I don't have anything to plug other than the book itself. I think that, yeah, for anyone who's considering it, I think short stories are dope. Give them a try. Yeah.
Where can people follow and support your work online? Like they want to keep up with like your upcoming novel or any work that you have going on, and just to kind of celebrate your future work.
Yeah, I would say I'm very much on Instagram. Perhaps too much. At Anelda Book Babe. Just find me there. You'll see lots of me, lots of my dog. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations again on this collection, and we wish you continued success, and we hope you'll come visit us in El Paso someday.
I would love that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. It was a great
Thank
chat.
you.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thanks.
You too.
Yay. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Literally Literary, recorded at Power at the Pass and brought to you by Border Census. This episode, we continued our discussion on I'll Give You a Reason by Anel Lopez. If you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Join us on our next episode and follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep.